Welcome to the Living the Dream podcast with Curveball. If you believe, you can achieve. Welcome to the Living the Dream with Curveball podcast, a show where I interview guests that teach, motivate, and inspire. Today's guest is artist, author, and free speech litigant Julian Raven. Julian's name is linked to one of the most enduring free speech battles in the last decade. So we're going to be talking to him about that battle and what he's been up to and what he's going to be up to. So Julian, thank you so much for joining me.
Curtis, it's a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you for having me on.
Why don't you start off by telling everybody a little bit about yourself?
Okay, well, I will. And I just want to let you know, I am standing with a virtual backdrop of the Smoky Mountains. And it's a part of my story because it was a wonderful place where my wife and I ended after traveling. We ended up and down the East Coast, different states. I think we did about 7 states. And the Smoky Mountains were one of the most remarkable, refreshing, and restorative places that I had been to on that journey, a place of healing. And that is my background to you today. So it's where I am, that place where I find myself constantly trying to revisit amidst the many trials, struggles, and obstacles that we face in our life. And my story is a story about that, is a story that is nothing I looked for. It fell upon my lap, basically. And it's ongoing. It's been going on for 8 years now. So it's long going, Curtis.
Well, talk to the listeners about, how your free speech battle happened. You created a 7x15 Trump painting and submitted it to the Smithsonian, and, talk about that.
I had been as an artist, we are always, or I should speak for myself, I am always seeking inspiration. And I would imagine other artists as well, that they and me, we are constantly looking for sources that are going to give you ideas and opportunities to create that are beyond just the normal everyday. You want something special, you want something larger than life. And so my eyes are always in that mode of hunting, and my mind, you're thinking, and you're sort of wanting to be part of something that's bigger than yourself. Being a New Yorker, although I'm British born, I was born in London, England. And as a young boy, at the age of 2 years old, my family moved to southern Spain. I grew up in a town called Marbella on the Mediterranean. Very beautiful place in Spain. It's actually a global tourist destination. Malaga, which is like the state, it's more like in Spain, they call it the province, is the capital of that area. And it is now the world's #1 tourist destination after their many years of, revitalization of this really old, ugly, commercial, industrial port. It's now an amazing place. Malaga City is fantastic. It's beautiful. I was there right before I came back to the US recently, and I was so surprised how it had been transformed over the last 30 years. Marbella, where I grew up, is in Malaga, the province of, very beautiful place as well. So that's my little bit of my background of where I come from. I am an immigrant to the United States of America. I became a citizen in the very same year I painted this painting of Donald Trump. And I've lived in New York State most of my American life, which is going on 25, 26 years now. And so I had heard about Donald Trump living near New York City when we were about 18 miles north in a town called Nyack. Trump was very present in this city. If you were delivering furniture, which I often did, or I did work in the city as a cabinet maker and like a contractor, you'd see his name, whether it was on a roadside sign saying, Trump has the next mile of the West Side Highway has been maintained and cleaned by Donald Trump, sponsoring something like that, to his name in lights, all in these huge building projects. So you knew about this guy. I mean, he was all over the place. And then the Apprentice show came out, and I always found that fascinating. How it was obviously theater, a lot of it, but it showed the character of this guy who was a straight shooter, and he just would kick people off the show and fire them. And I thought that was always very entertaining. So that was really all I knew about him. I didn't know more than that. But in 2014 in New York State, he stood up to run for governor. He was interested. He began to explore the possibility, and he began to investigate whether he could run as a Republican. But he was quickly shooed away because I think formerly he had been like a Democrat, and the Republican Party was not interested in supporting him at all. So he gave up that venture. But interestingly, Curtis, at that time, my associates, myself, and upstate New York, oftentimes we would be, really crying out for political change. We were looking for different leadership, a different governor. We were hoping that maybe this businessman from New York City would be the answer to our prayers, really, and that we'd have some practical sanity in the governorship, and we'd have a businessman who would actually attract businesses to New York. Because since that time, and with the sort of economic environment that we have in New York State for years now, we have more people leaving, and especially more businesses leaving the city and the state than coming into the state. So we were thinking maybe that would change. But he didn't. He didn't get the support. And then 2015 came around, June of 2015, and that sort of iconic moment on the escalator when he descends on the escalator and he announces his candidacy for president of the United States. Well, that got my attention, as I think it did the whole world in that sense, or at least the nation. So that's the sort of context there to leading up to the moment or the time when I would begin to consider painting a portrait of Donald J. Trump.
Well, talk about your free speech battle, against the Smithsonian. Talk about, tell listeners about the battle and how they contradict themselves and how to defend themselves publicly versus privately.
That is the big issue that came up through this journey that I joined, I entered on, which was painting this painting. At the time, most of the people that I knew were offended by the idea that Donald Trump would run for president. I had people say to me, I'd have to hold my nose to vote for this man, this type of sentiment. I was like, well, I was inspired to paint it, and I believe he's going to be president. So that's the sort of stage it was a long, drawn-out process, close to 600 hours of work. It was very intense. It was a remarkable experience, an inspirational painting experience that I had. But then I traveled the country and I showed the painting from New York to California. It was shown in Los Angeles at Politicon, this large political conference like Comic-Con, but for politics, with all these massive political names and folks. And there was an art show called The Art of Politics, curated by Yossi Sergent, who was the inspiration and patron behind the Obama Hope Portrait of 2008, that iconic image that was created to assist and did assist with Barack Obama winning the presidency in 2008. That image was painted by an artist, or created. It wasn't even that. It was a photoshopped photograph of a photo by a photographer named Manny Friedman, taken from the internet. And that was commissioned by Yossi Sergent. This is the guy behind the scenes who was the genius marketing expert who took his skills to bring this image into the public square and ran across the country with it, and was a huge part in that transformational election that took place. So he called me up and said, I want your painting in my show. He says, I can't stand Donald Trump. He's completely the opposite side of the political aisle. But he said to me, but your painting is a vision of hope. And he says, I want your painting in my show. And so it was a huge break for me to be invited to LA from New York. It's a wonderful story that my book, Odious and Cerberus, An American Immigrant's Odyssey and His Free Speech Legal War Against the Smithsonian Institution, describes. It's a wonderful narrative. It's an adventure, an American adventure as an immigrant coming to this country, all the ups and downs, all the disappointments and the struggles. And that's really what it is. When I saw your site, Curtis, and about how, your emphasis on, the curveball and overcoming, and how we have to persevere. Life is very difficult, very, very, very difficult, and at times we walk into episodes in our lives that are extremely difficult. And it was an adventure, but it was by no means easy, but it was remarkable. And so this whole thing took place. I was campaigning for a year. Then the election came at the end of 2016. And Donald Trump won, and I wasn't surprised. And then after that, I was like, well, what am I going to do? What do I do with this huge painting I've got now? And across the country, Curtis, I had met people who had said to me, this needs to be in the Smithsonian. This needs to be in the Smithsonian. I was like, I didn't even really know what that was. I heard the Smithsonian was in Washington, D.C., and it was a place full of rockets and spaceships. I had no idea. So I eventually applied to the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery after doing some research online. And I was amazed to discover that at the National Portrait Gallery, the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery in 2008, or the end of, and it was actually January of 2009, they had displayed the Obama Hope poster by Shepard Fairey. A large screen printed version was donated to the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery by one of the Podesta brothers, these Washington, D.C. Political lobbyists, people involved there. And they had donated this screen printed version of this iconic image to be a tribute to this amazing historical event that had taken place, the election of Barack Obama, and that it would be shown for the inauguration, etc. And they did. And it wasn't just 2009. They showed it again. It was on display for a long time. Then they showed it again in 2013. They had a huge celebration festival then with multiple portraits of Barack Obama at the 2013 inauguration, including the political campaign portrait, the Hope portrait that everybody knew. So when I saw that, I was totally blown away, excited, because I'm like, here it is. These folks show political campaign artwork for incoming presidents for the inauguration. That was what they did. I wrote this large application describing my journey, my story. I solicited letters of support from public officials all throughout New York State who I had met along my journey. It was a publicly endorsed application. There were representatives of about 200,000 upstate New Yorkers who had signed on and wrote glowing letters of support. They thought the idea was wonderful. And I submit this application to the director of the National Portrait Gallery, which you can find online. I just emailed it. And it had actually gone through a previous channel who actually forwarded it to them. But I had emailed this guy at the named Harold Kloster at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery as well. So the next day after that, I was like, I need to call these folks up and see how they're doing, introduce myself and say, hi, I submitted this application. Is there anything that I could do? If you need anything more, if it's missing something, let me know. I'm here. I just wanted to, show good faith and show up. And I spoke to the secretary and she said, well, we did receive it, but, we'll get back to you type of thing. And then, Curtis, my life was about to change.
let's take a quick break.
Okay, everybody, it's Michael E. Cullen II.
And I'm Sesame and Carta from the All Too Real 2 podcast. We're passionate about movies, TV, and pretty much all things pop culture.
Dive into the chaos of failed sitcoms, direct-to-video sequels, and the quirky realms of cinema and TV.
Join us every Thursday for your dose of All Too Real 2 entertainment.
We'll guide you through debates like whether Howard the Duck qualifies as a superhero.
Ponder if Larry the Cable Guy could be the new Rock or Schwarzenegger.
Discover if some shows and movies should have stayed in the cutting room.
Ever heard of a sitcom featuring that dictator with the funny mustache? Well, we watched it.
We're dedicated to unraveling the peculiarities of pop culture, sometimes with awesome guests.
So, if you're into the eccentric world of pop culture,
listen and subscribe to All Too Real 2.
Available wherever you find podcasts
and on Age of Radio.
Okay, well, talk about that life-changing event, because Judge Trevor McFadden, talked about the rejection of your artwork as odiously partisan. So talk about the political bias in cultural institutes.
I got a phone call, Curtis, about 15 minutes after I called the Smithsonian. I looked at the screen of my phone, and it was a 202 number coming in from the same number, but a one-digit difference to what I had dialed. And I was like, this is like the secretary calling me back. I answer the phone, and it's an Australian woman, and she introduces herself as the director of the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery. Her name was Kim Sayat. I'm someone who has a lot of respect for authority. I stood up. I was sitting down, so I stand up. I'm like, oh my goodness. I was not expecting a phone call from the director herself. I thought maybe the secretary would get back to me. So I get this call, and in a very snooty Australian accent, she starts to sort of disparagingly refer to my work, and then says, it's too big. Her objections started to come on. And I began to refute these objections. She said, it's too big. It's too pro-Trump. Then she said, it's not from life. And this is where the conversation goes off the rails. I knew the story, because this is how remarkable this conversation was, because it became a heated argument. She says to me, it's not from life. And that means if you paint a portrait of somebody from life, it means I sit down with you, and I sit there and I paint you directly from you sitting there, and I paint it directly to the canvas. That's painting from life. Like still life is painting bowls of fruit on a table, and painting a portrait from life, the subject is sitting right in front of you. So she's objecting, saying my portrait is not from life. And I said, well, the Obama portrait from 2009 was not from life. And she shot back, and this is where she began to lie. Oh, yes, it was, raising her voice. And I pressed. I knew the story. I'd been to LA. I met the guy who commissioned the painting. I knew the whole story intimately. And yet this woman now is raising her voice, shooting back at me. She jumps to the next objection. It's too pro-Trump. I said, too pro-Trump? I mean, how could a portrait of somebody be too pro the subject? That's what a portrait is. It's all about them. Oh no, this was too pro-Trump. And then the great statement, I think, that made it all sort of go off the rails. She's like, it's too political. And I said, too political? I said, you had the Obama Hope poster on display for 2009 inauguration. That was the political campaign poster of the election of Barack Obama. It was historic. That was 2009, 2013. And I said, my portrait is a political campaign image from the 2015, 2016 political campaign of this man, Donald J. Trump. What's also historic is a non-elected citizen who has never run for office before, runs for office and wins against all odds. When I painted that portrait, Curtis, it was the summer of 2015. There were 17 Republican candidates on the stage, 4 Democrat candidates, I believe, or 5. on the stage. And this man I painted believing he would become president. And it was a historic event that had taken place. Well, that wasn't good enough for this woman, who now is furious. And her last recourse was to disparage my work. And artists, when you submit work, you're putting yourself in a very vulnerable situation, because people can thumb their noses at you, they can mock you, ridicule you, they can accept it, they can praise you. You don't know. But she took the opportunity to say, oh, in her snooty Australian accent, well, I know how difficult it is when artists get rejected from museums. And then she says, it's no good. It was like her final attempt to, denigrate my work. And I was really stunned. I said to her, my painting is 7 by 15 feet. It's 102 square feet in size. And you're telling me it's no good by looking at a 4 by 6 inch photograph of it, not the original. You're looking at a photo, a reproduction of it on a computer screen, and you're telling me it's no good. And she recoiled, because I was rebuffing every arbitrary objection that she came up with. And I don't think she was expecting that. And she was mad. And as her voice reaches like a crescendo, she now yells out, basically, I'm the director of the National Portrait Gallery. Your application will go no further. You can appeal it all you want. Click. And she hangs up the phone on me. And I stood there stunned. I stood there silenced, violated, in my basement office. It was a dark morning. I can remember it so clearly. I was stunned by the sense of feeling powerless, feeling like someone had just basically rode over you and you had no recourse. And that behavior, Curtis, when you mentioned Judge McFadden, is what the judge obviously could see, and they never denied it. Kim Sayat was defended by the Department of Justice. They never denied a single word of my claims, and all of that conduct is in my claims. And the weird thing about this whole story, and that is why I'm still in it 8 years later, is that even though he said her actions against me were odious, and odious is a really strong term, hateful, odious is a very strong term, and he said her actions were partisan, he said they were perfectly legal. And that's a shocking ruling for a court to say. And that reason is the whole reason my case, even now, has its third petition before the U.S. Supreme Court, a petition for rehearing based upon what just happened in Washington, D.C. with Kim Sayat over the last month when the president fired her.
Well, speaking of your case being submitted 3 times to the Supreme Court, talk about how what that means to you when the Supreme Court refuses to answer the core constitutional question. Talk about what that means to you and how dangerous that is.
That core constitutional question that my case revealed is this: what exactly is the Smithsonian Institution? Is it a private charitable trust, or is it a federal government agency? Because what I said to you before, when the judge said her conduct was odious and partisan, but yet perfectly legal, it was because he said the Smithsonian is the government through and through, and the Smithsonian was exercising government speech. And when the government speaks, your First Amendment free speech rights are silenced. You have none when the government speaks. And that's true. When you go into Congress and they're holding a meeting, the government's doing its thing and speaking, and it's an agency of the government. You can't go in there and stand up and start saying, oh, everyone listen to me, and you have free speech. No, you don't. The government's speaking. That's true. It's legitimate. But the question is what is the Smithsonian Institution? Because all of my research, way back to the very founding, I have all the documentation cited in my book from the very beginning, is that the Smithsonian Institution is simply a private charitable trust. It was founded by an Englishman, and I'm like the Englishman trying to redeem it, believe it or not, who former Brit, but an Englishman by the name of James Smithson. It's called the Smithsonian Institution because it's named after a private citizen by the name of James Smithson, who gave his fortune of approximately $515,000 at that time, equivalent to about $80 million in today's economy. He gave that fortune to the United States, that at Washington, D.C., they would build an institution called the Smithsonian Institution, and it would be for the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men. It's a charity, Curtis. It's like a church. That's all it is. It's a private charity. But the government of the United States, Congress in this sense, because Congress wrote the bill or the law, which is called the Smithsonian Act of 1846, Congress is the trustee of this private trust. So what Judge McFadden did was say, oh no, this used to be a private trust, but it's no longer. He just made it up. He didn't quote any law. He didn't cite any legislative action that said that this original act of 1846 was now nationalized, was now converted from the private to the governmental. Nothing, because it's not true. So he made this up. And my research has shown that this enigma, this legal schizophrenia about the Smithsonian Institution has gone on since its founding. The founding document, the Vision Charter written by Joseph Henry, the founding secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, who gave his life, 37 years of his life, to serve as the first secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. He wrote the charter and the vision statement, and right at the beginning, because even at that time, people were trying to take this money and this bequest and turn it into a government operation. He was a citizen. He was the great American scientist at the time, first American scientist who had national and global impact with the inventions that he made. He wrote very clearly, this is a private organization. The government of the United States is merely the trustee. He made it very clear because already at that time, this institutional creep or this drift away from its original founding identity and the government overreach that was taking place was happening then. And I have documentation, newspaper articles. If you go to www.Smithson Institution, that's Smithson, not Smithsonian, SmithsonInstitution.com, that's my website, you'll see newspaper articles from 1927 and before from Washington's Sunday Star, where it discusses the same issue, how people even then were, it talks about a family coming from the Midwest and walking on the mall in Washington, D.C. and seeing the White House and the Capitol and all these different buildings, oh, the government, how wonderful. And then they see the Smithsonian, and the article says how they immediately assume that this is part of the government. And the article says, and they're shocked to find out that it's a private charitable trust. It doesn't belong to the government. It's a private trust. It's a private entity. And so these issues, Curtis, the contradiction that has taken place, even in my case, that deprived me of my First Amendment guaranteed free speech rights, that now, for the third time, is before the Supreme Court of the United States, because their job is to answer the unanswered question of federal law, which is, what is the Smithsonian Institution? What is its legal entity status? That has never been answered. My case is the first and only case to have ever sued the Smithsonian over free speech rights to have ever reached the Supreme Court of the United States. But guess what, Curtis? Guess who is there in the Supreme Court?
Who's there?
Well, the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, John Roberts, is also the Chancellor of the Smithsonian Institution. So this is so embedded in Washington, D.C., that even when the appeal and when my petition for the first time reached the Supreme Court, the Supreme Justice John Roberts, he recused himself. He couldn't be in the consideration. The other 8 justices, I think, were like, oh, we don't know if we want to answer. This is a little bit too close to home. And they rejected the petition. They basically avoided, and in my opinion, they betrayed their very reason for existence under the Constitution, even under the great famous case of Marbury versus Madison, where we had these government overlap questions, and the Supreme Court ruled itself, saying that basically it is the province of the judiciary to say what the law is. It's their job, the Supreme Court, is to say what the law is. And they refuse to do that because no one's ever asked the question before them. It's never come up. But I'm just this insignificant guy. I'm just this immigrant, basically from the woods up in upstate New York. And I'm saying, you need to answer this question because my guaranteed free speech rights have been trampled by this odious and partisan director. And you're saying, by not answering, that everything that happened to me is legitimate, allowing the government to pretend to be the owners of the Smithsonian Institution, which they're not. Now, Curtis, the most amazing thing happened last month when the president fired Kim Sayed. I was interviewed immediately by the Washington Post, and they said, well, can he fire Kim Sayed? No, he can't. The president has no authority over the Smithsonian Institution. It's a private charity, but in spirit he does, because he's the legal representative, elected representative of the United States. So he could point a finger and he basically poked the bear. But very interestingly, when the Board of Regents from the Smithsonian met just in, I think it was June 10th, just last month, I went to Washington, D.C., and I held a press conference, and I was interviewed again for the Washington Post about the situation, where I told them, they're going to compel Kim Sayed to resign. Before that took place, Lonnie Bunch III, who is the current Smithsonian secretary, he stood up and basically made a statement for the Smithsonian saying, we are an independent entity, basically saying, President Trump, get your hands off. You have no authority here, which is true, absolutely true. But the question now amplifies the contradiction that continues, which is they're saying they're independent, they're stating they're independent. A federal judge in Julian Raven's case has stated that it's the government through and through. And these two things cannot both coexist at the same time. If it is permitted to remain in its current illegal or illegally defined status, it violates not only federal law, not only trust law, but it violates the separation of powers doctrine, because the Board of Regents of the Smithsonian Institution, Curtis, is made up of the Chief Justice, the Vice President, 3 members of Congress, 3 members of the House, and 9 members of the public. So when they sit down in a quorum in their meeting and they make decisions together as one, Judge McFadden was saying, whatever decision they make is the voice of the federal government. It's baloney. It's impossible. There's no way, because you cannot have the 3 members of the separate branches of the government sitting down making a decision together as if they're one. And even the judge in my case called the institution Cerberus-like. And Cerberus is the 3-headed mythical hound dog guarding the gates of Hades or hell from ancient Greek mythology. As part of the title of my book, Odious and Cerberus, because this convoluted beast that he used to illustrate the Smithsonian Institution is the true problem, because until the Smithsonian Institution's legal entity status is clearly defined by the Supreme Court, who will say X, Y, Z, it remains in legal limbo. and it remains out of the control of the public. And your site, Curtis, where you say how you want to see, talk to people who are trying to help other people and see the benefit come to other people. This is a constitutional issue for we the people. The Smithsonian Institution belongs to us. It is ours. And we the people need to know what are our constitutional rights when coming to, entering, or wanting to participate in the Smithsonian Institution. Do we have constitutional rights because it's a private charity just operated by the government? Or is it a federal agency where it does speak for the federal government and we have no constitutional rights? That, Curtis, is the question that remains unanswered till today.
Well, how does it feel to have your case be the number 4 reason that the Smithsonian director was fired by President Trump?
What? I'm sorry, could you repeat that question?
Your case was the number 4 reason that the Smithsonian director was fired. How does that feel?
Well, that was like my first sense of vindication, to be on the president's list of 17 reasons to fire Kim Sayat, and I was at number 4. That was a huge step towards vindication. And that is part of my petition that is currently before the Supreme Court now, because I said in the petition, the president of the United States has highlighted my case as the number 4 reason for her. He called her highly partisan. The judge said she was partisan. This is what I've experienced, that you have silenced my attempts to have artistic expression participate in the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian says it's independent. And so what is it? So that's a huge layer of legitimization to my claims. And that was immediately submitted to the Supreme Court, like a day or two after that the Smithsonian came out and said, we are independent, basically. We're an independent, nonpartisan organization. And I'm like, oh my goodness. I mean, it's true. That's what they should be. They're always very good at saying what they are, but they are lousy at actually acting like that, because they allow for this distortion of law. That woman has been there for 8 years. They never did anything. They let her then resign, which she did just a few days after that meeting. After I submitted my petition, she resigns, which I believe they would compel her to do, because the president was then threatening the budget to compel Congress to cut into their funds, because they appropriate $700 million of taxpayer money each year. And this, you want to get a really bizarre picture of how bizarre the Smithsonian is? They appropriate $700 million of taxpayer dollars each year, but they have no public meetings when they meet. When the Board of Regents meet, the public is not allowed in there. We can't go and sit there and watch and listen to how they plan to divvy up the money and spend our money. We can't do that. You cannot file a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request at the Smithsonian to demand the emails, or you can't. You try to file a FOIA and they say, we're a private organization. You have the government doesn't have any effect here. It's crazy. And so that number 4 being on the list that the Washington Post revealed, it was amazing. And they asked me about it. And I was like, man, that's huge. I hope now with that, presidential scrutiny on the issue will cause them once and for all to answer the question. And it's not because of me. The question is, what about the next artist? What about the next musician? The Smithsonian has only ever functioned in the general sense from the contributions of the American people. When the Smithsonian was founded, the money that was given, and this is another issue, it should never be appropriating taxpayer dollars. The money, the fortune was borrowed by Congress, and Congress said, we're borrowing this $80 million and we're going to pay it back at 6% interest each year. And were doing that for a while. And the 6% interest at that time was a lot of money that would then build the institution's buildings, but they built empty buildings. The Smithsonian never created the content. What they did was build these huge halls, and then they said to the American public, bring your stuff, bring your arts, bring your possessions, bring your artifacts, bring your stories, bring your, your musket balls and your muskets, or bring all your stuff that we can then organize and catalog, and through that tell the American story. They never created, they never could. It was the point of the Smithsonian was to just facilitate the increase of knowledge in that sense at the beginning through the public's participation. Down the line, they opened scientific areas and began research, and all that was the increase of knowledge. That's great. But this is where another violation of law, of trust law, that the director did in my case is because she whatever you think of Donald Trump, I am not a Trump apologist. This was an experience that I had. This is I voted for Trump twice. I didn't vote for him on the third time. So it's not an issue about that. It's an issue about freedom of expression, artistic expression, and how the government cannot prohibit certain viewpoints that it doesn't like. And that's the issue that I have been facing, because they discriminated against my viewpoint. When they deprived me of showing that portrait, when they showed the Obama portrait, it was wonderful. That was an image that captured the zeitgeist and the moment and the remarkable historic event of the election of Barack Obama. And people celebrated that. The image was there. It's now cataloged. They slapped me. They basically slapped me to the curb, this woman did. That was bad enough. But the worst part is they deprived all the people that voted for Trump of also celebrating in the Smithsonian their election. Regardless of what people think, you don't like, you hate him, whatever, that's all legitimate. That's all legitimate. That's an argument. It's a whole different argument. But at the core of it, we're Americans. And these are the things we should celebrate, and the freedoms and the rights that we're given under this marvelous Constitution. But when they're trampled, we have to stand up. And again, I go back to your description of your site, how, the adversity and wanting to overcome and not giving up. That's been my journey. It's been more heartache than anything else, to be honest with you. 8 years of it, disappointment, discouragement, depression, wanting just to run away, hide myself. Just, I can't believe this. I'm this newborn citizen. I just swore this oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That's what an immigrant does. And then they trample your rights, and you're like, I can't bear this. And they mocked and ridiculed, and years of just laughter at what I was doing. And I'm like, I'm only doing what our Constitution was designed to do. It was given to us to redress the government. This is a good thing. It's a good thing for citizens. And like I said, the question at the end of the day is what happens when the next artist goes to the Smithsonian. Right now, nobody knows what rights you have. Nobody knows. And that's because the courts up until now have refused to answer the question.
Well, what prompted you to file a judicial misconduct complaint against a sitting federal judge?
Judge Cooper, Christopher Cooper, was the presiding judge over my second case. The second case against Kim Sayat was from 2022. I wrote my book, Odious and Cerberus. She's the antagonist in the book. So after writing it, I was like, I'm going to send Kim Sayat an email or a tweet telling her that I just wrote a book and that she's in my book. And I did. And I tweeted it to the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery director's page on Twitter, which had been changed because of my prior lawsuits to make it her private page, Kim Sayat, and yet it was all government announcement, all Smithsonian activity, all the action that were taking place were Smithsonian related. So I tweeted and she blocked me. And that then became grounds for another free speech lawsuit. At the time, I think the previous year, the president had blocked people on Twitter and they had sued him. They had won, and it raises the questions, how can government officials treat people on social media? Can they just block people they don't like, et cetera, et cetera? So those questions went to the Supreme Court in important cases like Linkey versus Freed. Well, Judge Christopher Cooper was adjudicating my case, and at first he refused to dismiss the case where the Smithsonian, the Department of Justice, was asking the judge to dismiss it. And what I had done was I took the original case that was filed by the Knights of Columbia, the Free Speech Institute, against Trump. This is how ironic it is. I took their case against the president and I just swapped out the names because I'm a pro se litigant. I defend myself, and I've learned this. It's one of the wonderful things about America that I have celebrated being here and being a citizen, that I can stand up as an individual and defend myself against the government. And I studied hard. I didn't know what I was doing most of the time. And so in this case, I took the brief that was filed against the president. It was great because it was exactly the same as my case. And I just swapped out the names and I filed it. And so the judge couldn't dismiss it. And he then said, we're going to wait for the Supreme Court opinion in Lindkey versus Freed to see what the Supreme Court says about this, because that case against Trump eventually was thrown out, was rendered what's called moot, because Trump was no longer president by the time it reached the Supreme Court. Joe Biden was president, and they said, well, he's no longer president. There's no grounds for this case anymore, and they tossed it out. So then there was no final answer for my case. So then the judge, in my case, Christopher Cooper, he's like, well, we're going to wait now for Lindkey versus Freed, which is another social media free speech case. And when the result comes out, basically, we'll know how to rule in Raven's case. Well, I waited and waited and waited a long time. And then the Supreme Court ruled in my favor. I was exactly vindicated, and the judge didn't rule. He sat there for months after that case came out, and I'm like, I can't believe it. Why is he not ruling? And I filed a motion to compel him to rule, which is usually you file a motion to compel the other side to do something. But I thought I'd just file a motion to compel the judge to rule. I'm like, the U.S. Supreme Court in multiple cases has ruled, and I cited it in my motions, has ruled that when a case is dealing with free speech issues, free speech cases, the court that's adjudicating that case is under Supreme Court obligation. They ordered all the lower courts that they must render a ruling expeditiously. They must rapidly attend to that case because the free speech rights of the person making the claim are in the balance. Well, Judge Cooper sat there and did nothing, months and months, and I was shocked because I'm still silenced. I'm still blocked. And I say, I can't believe this. So what I did was I filed what's called an interlocutory emergency petition to the U.S. Supreme Court. I went round the judge, round the appeals court, round the 16 court appellate board that's above even the circuit court appeals court, and I went straight to the U.S. Supreme Court with an emergency petition saying, you have ruled clearly that any case involving free speech rights must be adjudicated expeditiously. And yet Judge Cooper is sitting on his hands and refusing to rule in my case, I believe, because they vindicated my claims and I was going to get a win against Kim Sayet and the Smithsonian, and they couldn't take that. There's no way this little guy from the woods in Elmira, New York, this immigrant, this artist can get a win. We can't give him a win. So we're just going to sit there. And the Supreme Court eventually denied my petition. And then the judge, Christopher Cooper, wrote a scathing dismissal of my case. The first sentence of his dismissal is like an attack against me, where he mocks me and insinuates that he says, basically it says this, usually a judge will say at the beginning of a ruling, he'll describe the case so that the public can read. This case is about Joe Schmo and this person doing this, and he said this, and they did this, and let's see what the law says. That's a neutral explanation of the case. In my case, the first sentence he comes out and he says, this case is another skirmish in artist Julian Marcus Raven's ongoing campaign against the Smithsonian Institution. I was shocked when I read it. I'm the victim here. I'm the victim who's trying to redress the government and vindicate my First Amendment free speech rights that are guaranteed under the Constitution. And he's describing me as the aggressor. He's describing me as having a skirmish, another skirmish, an ongoing campaign against the Smithsonian Institution. It's outrageous. And that whole attitude that he reflected basically colored the entire ruling, where he refused to follow Lind-Key versus Freed. He refused to follow the two-pronged test that the Supreme Court ordered had to be conducted in order to establish whether a Twitter account or a social media account run by a government official, employee of the government, was ever used for promoting any official business of the government. So he refused. He basically said, Kim Sayed says this account is private, and we're just going to take her at her word. Raven's case is dismissed. And the worst part about it was that at the end of my case, at the end of that ruling, the last paragraph, Judge Cooper misnames me. He calls me Rayjet, instead of Raven. He should have called me plaintiff and addressed me respectfully. But they've done this a few times, and they just call me by my name. It's like a pejorative. He's like disrespecting me, like discounting who I am. He goes Rayjet, and Rayjet, Rajet, is a blend of my name and Kim Sayed's name. And so on a federal district court official opinion by a federal judge that has to be processed usually through clerks, and they got to read it, clean it, make sure this thing is clean and right. Here he misnames me Rayjet, which is like in the light of his opening sentence, was just another way to disparage me. And I was like, this is outrageous. He's ignored the law. He's disparaged me. And I was going to appeal. I started filing appeal. I got so discouraged, Curtis. I was like, I'm not even going to bother. I can't go through this again. I can't go through this because the courts are on the side of the Smithsonian. They're not on the side of the law. They're on the side, trusts historically for 1,000 years, since Magna Carta was brought about in the United Kingdom in the year 1000, I think it was. In that century, the 10th century, courts were always the defenders of trusts. In other words, when you leave a trust for whoever, and there's a trustee involved who's going to administer your property on behalf of the beneficiary whom you left the trust for, if that goes wrong, if they steal from the trust, if they do this or that, it's the courts and the job of the judges to defend the trustee, the testator of the trust, not they are to uphold the will of the dead person. They are to uphold the will and desire. And in my case, the courts are defending the trust, the trustees, the Smithsonian government. They're defending them because it's all part of this Washington, D.C. thing. And I'm this little outsider who can be disparaged and kicked to the curb. And that's what has happened to me. And so I wrote this back in January, and I was so discouraged. I was like, I just not even going to file the complaint. But now with the renewed attention to my case, I was encouraged, and I then filed that official complaint against the conduct and tone of this judge, because we have to say, who are these judges responsible to? If they can't just get away, they are appointed for life. I did a research on the history of federal judges, and since the federal judgeship has been in operation in the United States, close to the founding of this country, they've only ever removed like 7 or 8 judges. They are appointed for life. They're there for good. And I think it gives them the feeling that they can just behave like this and get away with it. So now, my only recourse as a citizen is to say, excuse me, this is not going to fly. I protest.
Close us out with some final thoughts, maybe if there was something I forgot to talk about that you would like to touch on, or any final thoughts you have for the listeners, as well as tell the listeners where they can get your book and throw out your website again.
Absolutely. I think what this has burdened me with, as an immigrant, you have a different perspective coming to America. And America, listen, we have to be honest, America has a lot of problems in our country right now. I'm a person of faith, first of all. I'm a minister of the gospel, first of all. I came to America as a missionary. First of all, I was on my way to Mexico to preach the gospel. So my faith is always in God first. And, regardless of how difficult the times are, we have to live in hope and believe for better times, pray for better times, but we have to act. We have to participate. America is a unique country on earth where we can participate in the process. We can run to the hills many, many times. It's what I've wanted to do, just disappear and go and hide myself in a hole somewhere because so sick and tired of it, so discouraged. But then what is a life if you do that? You just go live for yourself somewhere and that's it? Or we say, listen, we've been given a responsibility as citizens in this great country. I think what's different for me is that as a citizen, I have to swear allegiance, pledge allegiance, swear this oath to the Constitution in the swearing in ceremony when I became a citizen. And that compels me to act on behalf of what I swore. And so I would like to encourage your listeners, because we're all in the same situation in that we interact with our community and our neighbors, we interact with officials, law enforcement, we always interact. There's always things, there's always conflict, there's always problems. And we can all have an opportunity, or maybe the opportunity comes where we can all participate in trying to be the solution. Whether it's potholes in the road that every day you drive over and you just curse them under your breath. Well, it doesn't do anything. Complaining about the guy, I'm not the type of person that's always complaining about the guy. If I'm going to act. I'm going to do something. I'm going to knock on a door. I'm going to write a letter. I'm going to do some research. I'm going to find out what it is. I'm going to find out how to do it. And I'm going to do it. I don't have resources. I don't have a lawyer. I don't have lawyers. I've done this by myself. We're just a normal, simple family that loves God, loves this country, loves the opportunities that we've been given to live here, the freedoms that we've been afforded, and then the responsibility that comes with defending those freedoms. I say this to people. I say, because we live in a country where we can, we must act. And you can find out more about my story at www.smithsoninstitution.com. And my book is Odious and Cerberus, An American Immigrant's Odyssey and His Free Speech Legal War Against Smithsonian Corruption. You can find that at all major booksellers. I am coming out at the end of this month with the updated second edition with all the recent things that have taken place, which have been marvelous. But the book is available online right now. It's a great read. It's informative. It's a fun read. It's very funny. There's a lot of humor in it. There are pictures in it. It's a picture book. I made it so that the really tough issues of the story were sort of wrapped in sweet honey to make the book enjoyable, where you can delight yourself in an allegory. It looks like a sort of mystical novel. It doesn't look like it's a true story. The way that I presented it, it looks like it's just it's just a novel. It's a fun read. It's an adventure. But I wrote it in that way so that people really enter into the adventure part, but then also learning amazing history, American history, history of the Smithsonian, the law, the legal cases, the journey, the learning about art. And then obviously faith, my story, a lot of my faith is expressed so that this is an expression of my faith. Because like the Apostle Paul, in the book of Acts in the scriptures where he's being arrested all the time and dragged before the authorities, he's always like, I appeal to Caesar. And then I think it was Herod that says, well, to Caesar, you will go. And so based on the Apostle Paul appealing every way he could, I said, this is a good Christian thing to do. I'm going to appeal my way all the way to the Supreme Court, see what they say.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, check out Julian's website, keep up with his case, pick up the book, follow, rate, review, share this episode to as many people as possible. This is an important issue. Follow us on your favorite podcast platform and visit www.curveball337.com for more information on the Living the Dream with Curveball podcast. Thank you for listening and supporting the show. And Julian, thank you for all that you're doing, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Curtis, for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
For more information on the Living the Dream with Curveball podcast, visit www.curveball337.com. Until next time, keep living the dream.